This program is made possible by the loyal financial support of the friends and partners of Family Policy Institute.
You are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world.
So, good evening and welcome to the program. I'm speaking to Haley MacNamara, who's based in London at the moment, and she's from the International Coalition to End Sexual Exploitation. Haley, thank you for joining us on the program.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, Haley, you're part of the National Center of Sexual Exploitation that's based in Washington, D.C. with Dawn Hawkins, which is a good friend of mine. And I contacted her a few days ago to ask her for research and studies that have been done that make the link between pornography and violence against women, well, women and children. And she sent me some good stuff, and a member of parliament made a speech in parliament on the issue of gender-based violence in South Africa, using that research and that social data, which is very, very powerful and does make the connection. But as an expert, Haley, I wanted to speak to you, and I thank you for joining me from London to do this interview. But can you, from your expertise in the work you've done in the United States and now doing in the UK, can you talk about the research and the social data that shows that pornography definitely contributes to harm of women, social degradation, and violence?
Yes, absolutely. Well, exactly as you said, there is a growing and significant body of research showing that pornography has connections with sexual aggression and sexual violence. And the reason for that is because pornography actually has a very real impact on the brain. One of those impacts is it can create what's called an escalating pattern. Watching pornography might, after a period of time, veer into more violent material, more degrading themes, such as incest is a very real and troubling theme, or themes of sex with minors or child sexual abuse themes. And then for some individuals who watch it, they can escalate into wanting to act out the pornography that they have been watching. And that's troubling for a few different reasons. There has been great research on the actual content of pornography. For those people who have not been exposed to it, don't realize that between 88 and 94% of scenes actually portray physical violence or aggression from a man to a woman. And in pornography, 87% of the time, 95% of the time, women respond to that violence with expressions of pleasure. So pornography is literally teaching that gender-based violence or sexual violence is something that people like, and it's something that you can do with impunity.
Yeah.
So knowing that the message that pornography sends, it's not that surprising that studies, even a meta-analysis of from 7 different countries, found that watching pornography is significantly associated with increased sexual aggression.
Okay, so Haley, thanks for that. It makes a lot of sense. It really does, because there's a lot of groups here in South Africa that deny links between pornography and sexual violence against women and children. They say, well, it's just innocent fun and it helps them in their marriages or their relationships. But I've seen tons of research from all over the world, and particularly from the United States, making that connection. And what you just said, that once people use pornography, they have to go on to more harder stuff and more, things that we can't even mention here. And it's a progression. They get addicted to it. But most importantly, Haley, is that their minds are being shaped. It affects the brain. And then obviously the way they see women, and now they've been trained to look at women in a particular way because the pornography has done that to them. So is there any real cases that you can talk of where men or young boys, because a lot of young boys are watching pornography on their devices here in South Africa. But do you know of particular cases where men or young boys have consumed pornography and then acted that out and harmed women or children?
Yes, unfortunately, we hear those kinds of stories frequently. We've even seen, especially in the US, but we think it's a global, called child on child harmful sexual behavior. And what this is typically cases of young boys, maybe 12, 14, 16 years old, who have watched pornography and then act it out onto another child. And we've had the case of a 10-year-old boy who acted out and sexually harmed a neighbor girl because he had become addicted to pornography. And, this same pattern happens with adults as well, but especially with children, it's just so clear that, they had never even had a kiss before, but all that they were exposed to was pornography, and it caused them to act out and sexually harm someone. It's a real tragedy because it's harmful to the person who was exposed to pornography, and then it's also harmful to the victim.
Absolutely. Now, talking about that child-on-child sexual violence, that's a huge problem here in South Africa. And the reason for that is that young children from ages 8 years old upwards have devices, handheld devices, smartphones. And just about every one of them can access pornography, even hardcore pornography, quite easily. And it is having an effect on them. Tell us what the research shows when young boys and even young girls are growing up on this diet of pornography. What happens to them when they start becoming young adults?
Well, you're absolutely right that they're being exposed at such young ages. I know in the US, majority of college-age students were exposed before they were 13 years old. And a lot of parents don't realize this because, they think that they're raising the child with maybe certain values or that they're protecting them. But the pornography industry has algorithms that are trying to seek out young people in order to so children really are being targeted by the pornography industry, and it has many effects. We're seeing not only does it increase the likelihood of believing rape myths, such as that women enjoy rape, but it has negative impacts on their working memory, their ability to focus in school. It has problems with body image, and certainly the ability to even form a lasting and healthy relationship. Thankfully, many people are able to recover from pornography addiction or long-time pornography use. Our brains are really remarkable that way. But it does have a very significant impact on the whole person, especially if they're watching it from a young age.
Absolutely. Haley, so, you work with research and real-life cases in the United States, and now you're doing that in the UK at the National Center, which is now the International Center to End Sexual Exploitation of Women. So you know a lot on this. You're an expert in this field. And I wanted to ask you, if you look at South Africa, we have high rates, terrible, tragic high rates of sexual violence against women and children. It's called gender-based violence here, and people are tearing their hair out. Governments having all kinds of meetings. They're allocating money to fight this pandemic or this curse or this scourge, whatever you want to call it, but they're not making much headway. I believe that unless they tackle the pornography issue, unless they tackle the prostitution issue, where we have women and young girls standing on the side of the street, selling themselves to whoever comes along. And this kind of portrays women in a certain way. Now, I can't see how we can tackle this issue of gender-based violence unless we tackle the issue of the social degradation of women. And that is pornography, that is prostitution. Do you agree with that? And if you do, how do we then combat that? How do we begin to change and reverse what is happening in South Africa?
Yes, I absolutely agree. And it all comes down to prevention, because you can, restore and heal someone who has been sexually assaulted. You can rescue and restore someone who has been sex trafficked or prostituted. but you really have to try to prevent that from ever happening in the first place. And so, like exactly as you said, one of the key things is to address the issue of pornography, because as we've been discussing, the research, it does increase the likelihood that someone will be sexually aggressive, sexually violent to another person. So if we can prevent that from ever happening, that is going to save countless people from being in pain later on. And then similarly, we want to prevent issues like prostitution by sending out messages about the harms of sex buying, and that men should not be engaging in that behavior. It's harmful to the women, to society, and even to themselves. So absolutely, I think we should continue to help victims who've already been harmed, but we need to take a step back and look at what is our culture saying about women and their value, or about men and their ability to be honorable and to not harm someone else. And I think those prevention messages are very important.
Okay. So would you recommend to our government banning pornography, prohibiting online pornography, getting rid of sexually explicit images in the media and in advertising, so as to raise and elevate the dignity and the status of women? And would you recommend that our government do not decriminalize prostitution, because that is going to just add and fuel the violence against women and children?
Right. As for banning pornography, the benefits of that is that you can really prevent your society from following in the footsteps of a lot of countries like America that have been completely decimated by pornography. High rates of sexual violence, child-on-child violence, etc. So I think that is something that should really be considered. And at minimum, there should be laws put in place to make sure that children are not exposed to it. And then definitely with prostitution, the full decriminalization will only increase the amount of prostitution that's happening. It'll send a message that men can buy access to a woman's body, which is completely the opposite of the message that we want to be sending, that women are real human beings who do not have to be bought and sold as objects. So definitely the full decriminalization of prostitution is a really harmful policy. In other countries where it's been tried, it's led to increased prostitution and increased sex trafficking as well.
Absolutely. And so, Haley, I want to thank you, because I look at research around the world. Pornography is now called violence against women. And that's precisely what it is. It contributes and fuels harm against women and children. And so I want to thank you for coming onto this program, for sending me such great research and data, proving the correlation between pornography and sexual violence against women and children. And I wish you well in your work. You, Dawn Hawkins in Washington, D.C. We thank you for the global summits you have annually in Washington. So I want to thank you guys for the great work you're doing. You're such a help and blessing to us here in South Africa. Thank you for coming onto the program. Good evening and welcome to the program. I'm speaking to Sharon Slater, the president of Family Watch International and also the UN Family Rights Caucus in New York. Now, Sharon is based in Phoenix, Arizona, and she's appeared on this program many, many times. You might be familiar with the groundbreaking documentary called The War on Children. It's an expose on comprehensive sexuality education, the origins and the agenda behind that. And Sharon has done great work, not only in the US, but all over Africa and around the world, to help people understand this attack, insidious attack against children through the comprehensive sexuality education agenda. So Sharon, welcome to the program. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, thank you so much, Errol. It's my privilege to be on your show. We're so grateful for everything that you are doing to raise awareness on the need to protect children from, like you said, this insidious attack on children called comprehensive sexuality education.
Yes. So, my wife and I always bump into you all over the world when we attend World Congress of Families events. And I think the last time we met was at the United Nations in New York when we attended that International Day of Families events. But again, Sharon, I see you as a global expert on the CSE. I think you've done the most work on researching this issue and helping people understand what is behind it and who is behind it and what the real agenda is. And so you've been a great help to the people of South Africa, and we're fighting this thing. But the Department of Education, with the help of UNESCO, is fighting back. But you know, right now in South Africa, there is a lot of discussion about violence against women and children. It's called gender-based violence. And in the previous segment, I spoke to Haley MacNamara of the International Center on Sexual Exploitation about how porn or the consumption of porn fuels violence against women. I want to talk to you about comprehensive sexuality education, or CSE, as it's more commonly known, and the images and the content of this program devised by International Planned Parenthood Federation and driven by UN agencies like UNESCO and others. The content and the images, what that does to children, and how it fuels sexual violence of child-on-child sexual violence. Let me put it that way.
Sure. Well, most people are aware that the human brain is not fully developed until the early 20s. So when children are exposed prematurely to sexualized material, it creates pathways in their brain that are very difficult to change and get hardwired over time. So we know that children that are exposed especially to pornographic images can be trapped in these addictions that lead to behaviors, can lead to sexual abuse, one child on another, and so forth and so on. And we've discovered that these comprehensive sexuality education programs that we've been studying for a number of years have these elements that can really harm and damage a child's developing brain.
Yeah, so maybe if you could explain, because you've done a lot of research on comprehensive sexuality education, what kind of images are in this thing? Because a lot of people are not sure, they haven't seen it. Our Department of Education here has not really been open and transparent with this policy or this program that they've brought into the country. So people have, got bits and pieces of information, but you've actually went through it with a fine-tooth comb. Can you perhaps tell our audience what you've seen that's in it and you believe is harmful to children?
Yes, we have actually an analysis tool. It's called the 15 Harmful Elements Analysis Tool for CSE programs. And let's just take the Regional African Teachers module that was launched in Cape Town, South Africa. And it was a regional module to train all the African teachers all throughout Africa on comprehensive sexuality education programs. It's important to know who produced this regional module. Well, it was produced by UNESCO in partnership with UNFPA and also in partnership with an organization called Advocates for Youth. Well, who is Advocates for Youth and why are they partnering with these UN agencies? Advocates for Youth is this radical youth partner of International Planned Parenthood Federation. And International Planned Parenthood Federation, I know this gets a little complicated, is the one that benefits financially when children are sexualized. They have 65,000 service points all throughout the world, and they're especially focused in South Africa and African countries, because if they can sexualize children, then children are going to come to their clinics. In fact, this African teachers module at the end actually refers African children, tells teachers, African teachers, to refer children to Planned Parenthood clinics throughout Africa. Okay, and it has very graphic elements in it. There's, to just describe one of them, there's a picture of a female with her legs wide apart, where you see all of her genitalia. It's a detailed drawing with an analysis of all the different body parts. And one of the 15 harmful elements of these comprehensive sexuality education programs is they teach children they have a right to sexual pleasure. And they believe Planned Parenthood on their information actually says that children are entitled to sexual pleasure, and how to get different forms of sexual pleasure is important to their health and well-being. So they will mark off the sexual pleasure spots, teach children how they can stimulate each other, sexually, either through masturbation or mutual masturbation, so that they can feel this sexual pleasure, which they say is a right for children. So you can imagine how this would sexualize children and create this idea that children can be having sex with each other, which can lead to sexual abuse, violence against women, and so forth.
So, Sharon, you've gone through this thing several times, done a lot of research and background on it. Are you convinced that the ultimate objective of CSE is to sexualize children? It's not to inform them, to make informed choices, as their blurbs say, but it's to sexualize children, because I've also went through the material. And I'm not convinced that they are teaching children to make responsible decisions, because when you tell children it is a right, you have a right to sexual pleasure, and you must exercise that right, and you must even override your parents' concerns, then that means they're sexualizing children, and that is going to have huge implications on children, on sexuality, and also on the issues of abortion and all of those things.
Well, and it's not just about sexualizing children. It's about indoctrinating them in a whole radical sexual and gender ideology. In fact, this teacher's module for African teachers, it actually defines what's called gender identity. And it says that gender identity means you could identify as either male, female, neither, or both. That you could actually be something rather than male or female. So it pushes the radical transgender ideology. That's one of the harmful elements. Another one of the 15 harmful elements that we've identified is it usually turns the children actually into activists to promote abortion, to promote LGBT rights. It has them reanalyze their personal values and see that it's very manipulative, that maybe their values were formed by their parents and that they can have separate values from their parents, and they get to choose what their sexual values are regarding behavior, as it carefully brainwashes them and shapes their views towards these radical sexual and gender ideologies.
Yeah. So now I've seen that our Department of Education here in South Africa has partnered with UNESCO, or UNESCO is driving this really. There's been a lot of pushback against CSE, especially in last year, 2019, as more and more people found out about it, and parents and educators, they've been pushing back against it, because firstly, they weren't consulted, and now this thing is just being pushed on them. And they're very concerned about some of the content they've heard about. Not all of it, just some of it. And it's frightened them. And now, because of that pushback, because of the controversy surrounding CSE, our Department of Education with UNESCO is going to be hiring goodwill ambassadors. That's celebrities, well-known personalities in South Africa, to sell this lie of CSE, which means they're really getting desperate. Have you seen this trend in other parts of the world, in the United States, for example?
Yes, this is very big in the United States. In fact, we have a whole coalition in the United States called the Protect Child Health Coalition. The federal government has been spending $101 million annually, starting under the Obama administration, to fund comprehensive sexuality education in every state. But here's something really important that your listeners need to understand, is the lies that they tell the countries. They go into an African country, or even in the United States, into any state, and they start with, oh, you have this many teen pregnancies, you have this many teens with STIs, you have this, you have that, you're failing with what you're doing. So comprehensive sexuality education is going to solve all your problems, prevent teen pregnancy, prevent STIs. It's going to prevent violence against women, promote gender equality. There's no end to the claims that they make. In fact, South Africa is part of an agreement called the Eastern Southern African Commitment on CSE, Comprehensive Sexuality Education. It's ending at the end of this year, and all the UN agencies are pushing South Africa and the other 20 African countries that agreed to implement comprehensive sexuality education to re-enter this agreement for another 15 years, because this is their marketing plan to change all the gender and sexual norms of your society. They're doing it in every state in the United States. this Advocates for Youth that's pushing now through this teachers module. They even have the African regional teachers module on their website, because they really are the people that created that. They're pushing that in Africa, they're pushing it through the United States, and we have people rising up all across the United States working with us in our coalition to stop these radical sexual and gender ideologies coming through to the children through their number one tool in the form of comprehensive sexuality education.
Yeah, Sharon, we're doing the same thing here in South Africa. Family Policy Institute is leading the charge. As you know, we developed an alternative curriculum to comprehensive sexuality education, and we're calling it value-based sexuality education, because we're teaching children the truth about human sexuality and what they can do to protect themselves. So we want to put that out there and give parents and educators an alternative to CSE. And we're also going to push back against this campaign that UNESCO is funding here in South Africa to bring the truth to people in South Africa, because they're just not getting the truth from our educators. But we've run out of time, Sharon, on this segment, and we're going to be talking to you some more. But I just want to thank you again for all the work you do in the United States and across the world and here in Africa, and all the information you've shared with us and help us with, so that we can push back against this terrible attack and assault on our children's innocence, health, and welfare called CSE. And thank you, and hope to speak to you soon again.
Thank you. And I would just send your readers or those listeners here to sexedreport.org, which has the evidence that shows that comprehensive sexuality education does not do all the things that they're claiming.